So joining me now is the author of that book, The Victim Cult: How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Hey, Mark, thanks for joining me. I guess my first question for you is, what exactly is the victim cult?
Well, think about people who have had something awful happen to them, or people who merely think that, and then right or wrong, they may have been harmed, they may not have been harmed, but they obsess over it. And we know in our personal lives. So when I was writing the book, I'd ask people, "Have you ever met someone who thinks like a victim?" And people would go, "Yeah, I should tell you about my family or my friend or someone at work." Well, multiply that by millions, and literally you get what I describe as victim cult. So kind of an obsession over a real harm, or sometimes people make this stuff up in their heads, or they link to the wrong effect, the wrong cause. So the victim cult is really about people we meet every day, but multiplied by millions, and that how that affects our societies, our country, and even international relations.
So I think this is probably the first book of its kind that is sort of through a Canadian lens. What prompted you to write this book? Because I think it's sort of apropos for the time that we're in right now. And I don't know if that's, after reading the book, I was, you know, maybe it's just because of the 24-hour news cycle and social media, but you often feel like, boy, things are sure awful out there and everybody thinks they're a victim. But you look at this through both a Canadian lens and a historical lens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of always been this way, hasn't it?
It has, but the Canadian sort of spur for this, the spur for the book really was, I've done a lot of policy work over the years on Aboriginal issues. And what I found continually was some, and I emphasize some, not all, but some First Nations leaders in Canada relentlessly portray themselves as victims. Now, historically, in some cases, select cases, many cases, they were, or their ancestors were, and that's an important distinction. We are not our ancestors. But the problem with that is for some First Nations leaders to continue to blame everything on 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. There's a twofold problem with that. One, by looking back, you don't look forward. And that's a problem, because how do you succeed if you're always looking in the rearview mirror, right? You end up in a collision, you end up in an accident, so to speak. The other problem with it is you really link the wrong cause to modern day effects. So let me give you a clear example. We often hear today that the problem with Aboriginal Canadians' incomes or social economic indicators has everything to do with perhaps what happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago, in some cases residential schools. And without downplaying the effect of, say, sexual and physical abuse on reserves, which I don't think we should, to blame everything on residential schools or to blame everything on reserves is actually a mistake, except in this way, which some First Nations leaders don't get or are not honest about. Many First Nations reserves are in the middle of nowhere. If you want to look for a modern day reason why some Aboriginals, especially specifically First Nations, right, what used to be called Treaty Indians, for federal purposes, are not succeeding, it's because they're on a reserve in the middle of nowhere. And geography explains a lot more than allegations of racism or colonialism, or allegations that somehow Canada was a genocidal state akin to Nazi Germany, which actually a report earlier this year came out and alleged just that, right? So I take that apart, and to give you a clear example of where Aboriginals can succeed in this country, I looked at census data from the last census. And very simply, if you look at young Aboriginals ages 25 to 34 with a university education, they have the exact same incomes, in fact, slightly higher than other Canadians. And why is that? Because they are more likely to be in cities. They're not stuck in a reserve in the middle of nowhere. And so their incomes are equal to those of other Canadians. And if you have a PhD as an Aboriginal between 25 and 34, you earn about $3,000 more every year than other Canadians. So the problem really is, and the good thing about this is what that points to is the problem is geography and education, and both those are correctable. But to make links, as people do, to 50 or 100 years ago, when First Nations leaders do that, that's the problem. They're actually not, linking up the right cause to the effect. And that's unfortunate because it can hold people back. And so that's kind of where the book started, was this observation that First Nations leaders often make these mistakes, as do others. And that harms Aboriginal Canadians more than anybody else.
That's an excerpt from my weekly show, The Gun Show. It's an interview-based show that I do every Wednesday night, where I talk to conservative journalists, filmmakers, activists, even citizen newsmakers. However, the show is only available to our premium subscribers, but it's easy enough to subscribe. Just go to premium.rebelnews.com.